Hi there, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the FDA Form 1572. And honestly, if that doesn't just make you drowsy, just the thought about talking about a bureaucratic form, I'm really sorry. But it's really an important topic because it's not a long form. You might have already seen it in the module. It's 2 pages. It looks pretty simple, but it can be an unexpected headache for the research coordinator. So that's the reason we're going to talk about it. So just a little reminder, we've already talked about the FDA Form 1572 in other classes, but as a refresher, because, you know, human brains forget things, this is really known as the Statement of Investigator. By and large, though, people will call it they'll just call it the 1572. But it is also known as the Statement of Investigator. It is on an enforceable form. Yeah, that's all you really need. We're not going to go into the FD&C Act, but it is required and it is important and it is enforceable. And it applies to every study, phase 0 to 4, well, phase 0 to 3, excuse me, if it's conducted under an IND, right, Investigational New Drug Application. And so that's pretty much every study you're going to be involved with as a coordinator. It is not required for medical devices. So if at some point professionally you switch teams and you leave the drug development area and you go into medical devices, one good thing that you would have going for you if you were to be a coordinator with device studies is you wouldn't have to worry about this form. So why do we use the FDA Form 1572? 2 pages, like I said, pretty simple on face value, and it has 2 really important functions for everybody involved in clinical research. The first, from the research coordinator's perspective, and for your monitor, it's the formal documentation of your PI's commitment to comply with regulations. It's the statement of the investigator. Your PI is going to sign, all of your investigators are going to sign a form, this 1572, and the bottom it says, I attest to the fact that I can do this study and I am going to comply with everything. It also provides the sponsor with information about the PI's qualifications. We have the CFR and ICH both talk about who is qualified to conduct a study, and this form is really handy because it is a standardized way for your sponsor to have this information about your PI. And so from the sponsor's perspective, that's really helpful. So every 1572 is a form which allows the sponsor to demonstrate that this investigator is qualified to do the work. Interestingly enough, you're going to fill these out. They are important, but the sponsor is not required to submit the 1572 upon receipt. So before the study starts, you're going to submit a 1572 to the sponsor. The sponsor is just going to hold on to this. The FDA does not want this, and even on the form, the FDA says, do not send this directly to us, send it to your sponsor. So the sponsor will warehouse all of these forms, and they will actually submit them later. Eventually, if this investigational drug is submitted to the FDA for approval in the IND, then those 1572s will be sent to the FDA as part of the package. But you can't really start a study without that Form 1572. So let's look at the form. Now this form's a really old one, the new one is in the module, but they're still the same. The new one is nice because you can populate it electronically. This is an older form and you couldn't do that, but they're still formatted. They're still the same. They're still the same information. So the first question you're going to do when you look at this is, what is the OMB expiration date? And you're already like, that's a new acronym I'd never learned. Heather never taught me what OMB means. It's the only place you'll see OMB. And it's the Office of Management and Budget's time frame for this form. So in this example in my lecture, the form expired May 31st, 2009. On June 1st, 2009, you could not use this form. You had to have the new form. So that happens if my PI signed this in 2008 and now it's June 1st, 2009. Says the PI, do I need to complete a whole new one and have my investigator sign it because now there's a new form? Thank goodness, no. So I'm getting this information from the FDA. Years ago, you could just browse the FDA website for information. Now there is an actual, since 2008, there's a guidance document, which is also in this module. And the FDA seems to have a pretty practical, common sense approach to this form. So the form's not going to change, but there is this option with the OMB. If they need to have a new form, they could do it. But no new 1572 is needed just because you're using one. As long as the signature date was prior to the expiration date on the form, you don't need to update it, which is really nice. You know, this is important for a research coordinator because you really want your time to be used in the most valuable way possible, and filling out new forms is not always valuable. All right, name and address of the investigator. Okay, this seems like a trick question, right? Whose name is required? You know, people actually ask this. They really want to know, how do I list the name? It's like when you get your airline ticket now, it has to be the same name that you have on your identification, right? Something like this. So it has to be the legal name of your investigator. If there has been any change, if there's any difference between what's going to go on the 1572 and the medical license, the nursing license, whatever license this person has, you're going to want to be able to document that there's a name change. For example, I use McCreary as my maiden name. My name McCreary is my nursing license. My married name is Zerker. I would have to perhaps have some, if I went and I used both names, there would have to be some way that I would document that I have actually used two names, right? So hopefully your investigator is going to be nice and practical and only will use one name. Okay, now next trick question, what address should be listed here? This actually is not as tricky as it sounds because this is a really good question. Lots of people, professional people, will maintain more than one office. So what address should be listed here is a good question. It's the primary address of that principal investigator, or we'll just call him an investigator. And so it is, from the FDA's perspective, where could I find this person if I wanted to go and talk to them, right? So what is the primary address? Your investigator might spend 3 days a week at one location, two days a week at another location. I would put down the 3-day-a-week location, right? So just where the person spends most of their time. Okay, this is a good question. Should any co-investigators be listed here? Because we have the name and address of the investigator. The question, should I list everybody else who's a co-investigator? Well, first of all, the FDA doesn't recognize a co-investigator or sub-investigator term, really. But if there's any other person who's going to be behaving as an investigator and assuming responsibilities, then yes, but you would have each investigator sign their own 1572. So it's only one person per form. Okay, that's a little bit of a drag because if it's a busy research practice, you might have a lot of 1572s. But in a way that sort of creates some simplicity, so if someone leaves a study, you don't have to update that 1572 every time, but only one person per form. Okay, so the number 2 is the education, training, and experience, and then you have to attach it. So does the CV, the curriculum vitae, or other, it can also be a statement of qualifications, does it need to be updated during a study? So, you know, a study might last several years, and so at the start of the study, your investigator has a CV that's all nice and neat and current, and 2 years later, that CV has changed. There are additional qualifications, some publications your investigator was able to publish, things like that. Does that need to be updated during the study? And you're very happy. The answer, according to the FDA, is no, which is wonderful because if you have even just 5 investigators on a study, and every time they updated their CV, because they're smart, they're going to be very busy and they're professionally accomplished, they're going to have a lot of updates to their CV, you would just be spinning your wheels a lot on this. So this is a really good answer. So one CV at the start of the study, and that's all that's needed. Are the CVs required to be signed and dated? This is a common request from sponsors. They want those CVs to be signed and dated. to the sponsor, it's like an extra layer of verification that that document's authentic. And so sometimes, and actually very commonly, sponsors will ask this. In some research practices, the investigators will just sign their CV at the beginning and just get it over with, so as to not slow things down for the research coordinator. And the FDA says no. The fact that on the second page the investigator is going to sign this form, the FDA sort of considers that to be really saying, in signing this form, I am assuring you that not only am I going to do everything I say in this list of obligations, but also I'm attesting to everything on this form being accurate and correct. Does that mean that your sponsors are going to stop asking you to have these signed? Not at all. And sometimes you have to make a decision in your relationship with your sponsor if you want to do the little extra silly work that they want. So this would be one of those kinds of things that, even though I would understand that it's not required, in the FDA's view, if my sponsor wants the CVs to be signed, then I would be willing to do that, but it's not required. So if you spend the first year on the job having all the CVs signed, and then someone doesn't care if they're signed, you might be alarmed, but they don't have to be signed. Okay, number 3, name, address, medical school, hospital, other research facility where things are going to be done. So what really is a research facility? That's a pretty broad term. And so this oftentimes comes up in question because what's the name and address of that place? And it's really where any study activities are going to be conducted. So if it is in the private practice, that would be considered a research facility because research activities are going to be done there. So it's wherever this is going to happen. Is it a hospital? Is it a private practice? Is it an outpatient clinic? Those kinds of things. Anywhere where you're going to be collecting data is how I would look at it. Okay, this is a good question. If an investigator sees study subjects at more than one site, should all the sites be listed? And I'm sorry, yes. So this might be a little bit of a long list. So in number 3, you're going to include every place, right? Anywhere where clinical investigations are going to be conducted. So if it's more than one site, you have to list all sites, yes. Can other types of facilities be listed? Because this list just says medical school, hospital, or other research facility, and that is a very small list, right? So then you think, well, what if I have a list that's not, a place that's not on this list? Yeah, you're going to put any place else that's important. If you have a research lab that's involved, if you have a storage facility for any kind of biologic specimens, a storage facility where investigational drug samples are managed, then yes, all those places that would be clearly important to conducting the clinical trial, then yes, you would include those there too. This is a good question. So if you have a home health nurse that's performed study-related activities at the home addresses of subjects, do you have to list the home addresses of those subjects? So we're saying where clinical investigations will be conducted. So if you have a study where home health nurse shows up at a patient's house, draws some PK samples, for example, does that count? Now this could really create a lot of work. If you had to include the residence of every participant who had a home health nurse and they did study-related activities. Thank goodness the FDA, I know the FDA gets a bad rap, but I will tell you the way they wrote this guidance is very practical and level-headed for research coordinators. So they're saying, no, that's a little overkill. Okay, so number 6, the names of sub-investigators who will be assisting the investigator in the conduct of the investigations. So who should be listed as a sub-investigator? This could be really a wide net of people. Okay, and so anybody who makes a direct and significant contribution to the data. This is really going to be some internal discussion at your site and possibly with the sponsor of how you're going to define sub-investigators. So having an ongoing and significant involvement in study-related duties would include someone who's would define someone as a sub-investigator for the FDA. That's really wide and open for discussion internally. So your site will probably have, if they don't have an SOP about defining sub-investigator, that would be something very helpful to have, so that all your 1572s are filled out the same way with regard to defining sub-investigator. All right, so then the next question, following logically along with this, is should research nurses, other nurses like clinic nurses, residents, medical fellows, office staff, other hospital staff be listed? Okay, because now this could be a lot of people. And again, it goes back to who's making direct and significant contributions to the data. So people who are ancillary, so sort of on the periphery in terms of responsibilities, or who provide intermittent care, do not have to be included. So a good example would be phlebotomy staff, right? So if the patient goes to the hospital to get blood draws done, you wouldn't include the phlebotomy staff at the hospital, right? Because they are ancillary, they're necessary, someone has to draw those samples, but they are not assigned a significant and ongoing relationship to the study. Again, this is going to be some internal talk that you'll have, but you want to be very practical about who you include as a sub-investigator. So sometimes research nurses and research coordinators are included, sometimes they're not. And it will vary by sponsor and by research site practice. If medical residents participate in the study as a routine activity associated with a clinical rotation, should they be listed here? And again, the FDA is pretty practical. They said, nah, not really. You're going to have a rotation, so 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks at most, right? In these clinical rotations, and they're going to rotate through. So you're going to have a new group of residents every so often. So you could include in here a statement saying that there will be residents participating in some research activities. But again, the FDA doesn't expect to have this included, which is good. You could spend a lot of time every 4, 6, 8, 12 weeks, or how often, updating all the residents as sub-investigators. And it could really end up eating a lot of your time. So some other questions, but before I go any further. If you haven't looked at the 1572 lately, go into the module and look at it. Look at it front and back. I was really just talking about this from a research coordinator perspective. What do you need to know to fill this out nice and easy without losing, pulling out hair? But I want you to go and look at the second page, which includes all the responsibilities that the PI or the investigator who's signing the form is agreeing to do. So some other questions come up in the course of life. And the one good question is, does the IRB need to review and approve the 1572 as part of that initial approval? Because that's when the 1572 is being filled out. It's being filled out at the time that you're about to initiate the study. No, there's no formal requirement. However, I will tell you, IRBs do ask to see the 1572 during their review. So they want to know, has it been filled out, right? It's just sort of part of the IRB making sure everything's in good working order. But they're going to ask for it. So is the investigator required to submit an updated 1572 to the sponsor annually? So the sponsor is going to do, there's some annual things that happen. Remember, the IRB is going to review the study at least annually. If the risk is significant, they might ask to review it more frequently than that, but at least annually. The sponsor is going to publish an updated, a new and updated investigative brochure annually. So there's some annual things that happen. And sometimes the question comes up, is the investigator required to submit an updated 1572 annually to the sponsor? And again, there's no formal requirement to do this. If there's a significant change, then yes, the 1572 has to be revised and sent to the sponsor. So a name change, a change of mailing address, a change of where the research is going to be conducted. So if the research is conducted at one hospital and then the investigator changes affiliation and moves to a different hospital, a new 1572 would be required. But that's the only time. Whenever there's revisions, then yes, you have to send it, but not just annually for the sake of doing work. So hopefully you will understand that in case a sponsor asks. If a sponsor asks, say, hey, it's annually, can you send it to us? You can say very confidently, there's been no changes to the 1572, no revisions, the original one still stands. Okay, another question. At the time of the initial review, the IRB informs you, the PI, in other words, you, because you're the one doing the form, about an error they found on the 1572. What sanctions can the IRB take if the errors are not corrected? Just because the IRB says there's an error doesn't mean there's really an error. So let's say they think there's an error, but there's not. Can you ignore them, essentially, is what this question. Yeah, the 1572 is outside of the IRB's jurisdiction, so they really can't take any sanctions against you. But you do want to have a good working relationship with the IRB. So it would be wise to consider what they're telling you and then talk to the IRB if a difference of opinion occurs. The last thing you really want to do is make them mad by ignoring them. So if the IRB tells you that there's an error and it's not true, you can reach out to them and talk to them and perhaps clarify or at least come to some understanding and resolve whatever they think is going on. But yeah, they don't have any jurisdiction here, but you know you're still going to be smart to listen to them because you need to have a good working relationship with them. Okay, so here's a scenario. 2 questions. Your site completes the Form 1572 and sends it to the sponsor. The sponsor says you completed it incorrectly and returns it to you for correction. This goes back several times before the sponsor finally considers the 1572 filled out correctly. Here's the first question. Since every version of the 1572, incorrect as well as correct, has been signed by the PI, should all of the versions be kept or only the correctly completed version? This is a really good question. The answer is, yeah, you could consider the wrong ones as draft copies, right? Since the sponsor said that's not correct, we're not going to accept it, you would say those were really just draft because they weren't the final version. Of course, you're going to keep all of your sponsor correspondence about why this wasn't correct. Please send us a new one. Here's the new one. You know, but all of that back and forth dialogue and their final decision, you're going to maintain as your correspondence and part of your regulatory files. So then if you decide to maintain all the versions, what should you do with the incorrectly completed versions of the 1572? This could create some confusion when people come in and look at your regulatory files. You know, typically you only have one version of 1572 completed at the start of the study. So now you've got 4 or 5 copies in there. It's going to be a little confusing. You're really going to, this is now really about maintaining documents in a sane way. One thing you could do then is if you're going to keep all the incorrect ones, you could mark them as draft so that anybody who comes in could look and see, oh, okay, there was a progression and why there are these 4 or 5 versions before the final one. So marking them as draft could help sort of clarify that. You're also going to maintain all of your sponsor correspondence, right? And so part of it could be putting copies of emails and things like that, stapling it to the draft version so that anybody could come in and make sense and see the whole story. But really, this is sort of word to the wise. Only have the PI sign it after your sponsor says they're good with it, right? So then if you send them a copy, it's unsigned. I'm not nearly as worried about maintaining that. It's the PI signature that makes it a formal document. And so you could get their feedback before you get it signed, and that might be a little bit easier for you. But those are the kinds of things you learn on the job through trial and error. And hopefully some of these things I talk about in class will help you to be a little bit ahead of the game, and you won't have to learn the hard way like a lot of us, myself included, have done. So hopefully these are good talking points.